Throughout the years, Metroidvanias have become one of my favorite game genres. As my journey started with a single game, Hollow Knight, it has quickly developed into a large array of games that I have thoroughly enjoyed. For the most part, each Metroidvania game that I have played has been distinct in many ways, giving it its own unique gameplay experience that either works or doesn't. For the solid 3 people that don't know what a Metroidvania game is, it's honestly pretty simple. The core gameplay mechanics generally revolve around a character with some kind of wacky stick or hands that finds themselves in a world the player doesn't know. As you explore, you find more areas that you can't quite reach yet and no way to traverse through them. But you go down the lightly guided path of the only way that you can go, find some kind of boss, kill it, and get a combat or movement ability that allows you to delve further into the world. Rinse, repeat. Now, despite the very rudimentary knowledge of Metroidvania games that I just thrusted into your face like some stale, lukewarm McDonald's, there is a lot of ways that game developers take this formula and completely, or even slightly, change it up to give some top-tier games. So for today, so that I can gush about one of my favorite game genres, I'm going to be talking about my top 3 Metroidvania games. Except not really. Now, all of the games that I will be delving into are in my top 5, but they are not my top 3. Technically, it's like my top 2 to 4, but really, my favorite Metroidvania game, and honestly my favorite game altogether, is Hollow Knight. Now, I can hear the eyes rolling. Yes, I am basic, but in all honesty, it's just a very good game. From the art to the music to the amazing boss fights and intriguing lore, it all comes together in the perfect package of a Metroidvania. But the problem is, all of that has been said before, and I am not eloquent enough to have more things to say that hasn't already been said about the game today. So for that reason, I will be skipping it and talking about my next further down games. So without further stalling, I will get into talking about my top 3 Metroidvania games. Now, in terms of Metroidvania games, Worldless is a bit of a weird one. I found it incredibly intriguing when I first looked into it, and delved into the world and story. However, very quickly, I decided that the style wasn't really for me. So before even getting out of the first area, I gave up and stopped playing the game. However, I later saw my dad playing it, and my interest was piqued. So I strapped in, decided my initial opinion could go to hell, and gave it another try. And I am so glad that I did. Worldless is such an interesting and unique Metroidvania-style game that I am so glad I played through. Now let me tell you why. Now, first, I want to get into the thing that initially threw me off with this game, and that's the combat. I went into this cool space-looking game expecting a fun, stylized, flashy back and forth with the combat. And technically that is what the game has to offer, however, it does it in an interesting way. Instead of general fight where you duck and dodge and dive around, you're instead locked into one place in a turn-based fighting style. Each person gets a certain amount of time on their turn to do whatever attacks they want, at least technically for the player, while the others can't do any attacks at all. For the player, all there really is to do is defend, while generally the enemies don't do much of anything, though they tend to sometimes have counterattacks and little things to be aware of as you're attacking them. However, each enemy has their own specific way of being defeated. These ways generally come down to the weakness of any given enemy, as well as one key feature of the game: absorption. In the game, when an enemy's absorption bar fills up, you can try and absorb them. The higher the bar, the easier it gets. Doing so is technically the only way to beat an encounter, and you will not have to deal with that enemy again. Doing so will basically give you a skill point that you can build up all the various magics and physical attacks that each version of the player gets. Each of the player's characters get 3 physical attacks, as well as 2 different elemental spell attacks. For the blue player, her physical attacks are a sword, a bow, and an axe that she can use interchangeably based on the buttons the player presses. They have ways that make them better, such as perfect button presses, charges, or combos with the other weapons. One specific thing that works well with the blue character, which is also a thing in the red, is that when she attacks people a lot, it builds up a light on her sword that allows her to do bigger hits with any of her attacks. Her magic attacks use the elements of lightning and ice. Each of these are pretty simple. They can be chained or charged based on how much you level them up. For her blocks, she can either block physical or magical attacks based on a button you press. with the little add-on being that she can do perfect blocks, add layers to her blocks, and after blocking enough things, she can interrupt a particularly deadly attack and get away scot-free. Red Guy works completely differently on both ends of the spectrum. For his physical attacks, he uses his bare hands, which work well for doing basic attacks and damage. He has a whip, which is good for being at a distance and avoiding counterattacks, and can launch through the ground to hit enemies at a distance. And he uses a seal, which is incredibly good for building up the absorption gauge. Despite these being different, they are built on it in the same way through the upgrades to increase perfect timing, charges, and bigger attacks when you hit enemies enough time. The place where the Red Guy truly shines a different color is in his defense. Instead of simply having a barrier that blocks magic or physical attacks, he does things differently. Instead, he has a block, which at the start does nothing more than halve the damage he's received, but after some upgrades can heal back a portion of that amount, or even deal back a portion of the amount of damage that he would have received back onto the enemy. His other defense option is an evade that allows him to completely avoid getting hit by an attack, which is balanced by having a decently long startup time and doesn't really have any fancy bells or whistles, but does allow him to gain back more time in his turn to continue attacking. A final piece of the puzzle that is Worldless combat is that there are upgrades that enhance having the two of them in battle together. For context, though everyone watching this should know that there are spoilers everywhere and should go play the game, about halfway through the game-ish, you get access to the Red Guy instead of only having the Blue Girl. As a result, it changes up the combat greatly, and one of the ways that it does so is by letting you switch which person you're using during combat. You can freely switch in your turn between the two people, allowing you to hit an enemy with all kind of elemental and physical attacks to try and wear them down, while also allowing you access to each defensive option either has to offer. It makes things way more fun and enhances the strategy of combat, in my opinion, by keeping you on your toes with which character model you currently are within the battle. Also, as an upgrade, you can have the player you are not currently playing as come in for a follow-up attack after one of your own magical attacks to hit them mid-combo and switch to that person. The final thing it adds is when both of them have a technique built up, which is done by attacking enough times or defending enough times, they work together to hit with a massive joint attack that greatly fills up the absorption gauge, which helps big time and is a huge game changer during long, drawn-out battles. For the art in Worldless, I don't have nearly as much to say on it as I did when it came to the combat. Now, for this game specifically, it's because the combat is extremely unique and I felt needed a bit more explanation. However, with that being said, the art within Worldless is simply fantastic. It is a beautiful landscape of vibrant colors all dancing together to make for wonderful visuals to the eyes. There was never a moment when I was playing that I didn't enjoy looking at the areas that I was in. The greens, pinks, purples, red, blues, grays all came together to give each area a distinctive aesthetic while still feeling like they were all within the same game. On top of that, the spectacle, which is the combat, is simply breathtaking as you play and honestly sometimes distracted me with how good it looked. There's a lot of bright flashes and big, more vibrant colors covering the screen as attacks are made against the enemies. Each one, however, was well conveyed and made for a good tell for which attack the enemy will be using so that the players can react. In a short story shorter, it allowed everything to come together wonderfully in a rainbow of hues. The story aspect of Worldless is something that I honestly feel like I shouldn't really say much about, or even can't say much about. I feel like I understand everything that it is trying to say, but at the same time I don't. I feel like there is something that I am missing. Now, could this be because I got stuck bashing my head against the wall in the area made to test your skills as a player? Potentially, but also I'm not always the best at paying attention to things as they happen. Getting a bit more in depth to the story, I do understand, however. I would like to say that I enjoyed what I caught of it. In a world where these blue and red warriors battle each other endlessly in a war trapped in time, the main characters have something happens to them that changes everything. They stop their fighting and become more aware of the universe that is around them. They encounter challenges and dangers and ultimately decide to work together, which angers higher beings that come to try and snuff out the two lights that try to defy their status quo. As they fight and triumph through these things, together, they come up against an enemy that they can't really beat. They fight and fail, and eventually the Red Guy's left impaled, injured and dying. The Blue Girl struggles as hard as she can before seemingly absorbing the entity within herself. There, she finds the Red Guy on the floor. broken and dying, and with one last act of desperation does something magical and ends their universe, creating another big thing. Now, this is a very shortened version that may not even be completely correct and is really just a synopsis of the different events that happen throughout the games. So for anyone who knows more or viewed things differently, I would love to hear about it so I could learn a bit more about this amazing, amazing game. When talking about the platforming in Worldless, there honestly isn't much to say for it ability-wise. However, much like the combat, a lot of the fun comes in switching the two characters. Both the red and blue characters each have their own specific movement abilities that they don't interchange at all. For instance, the blue girl gets a dash, sprint, air dash, and a wall jump/run. A lot of these are pretty much the same, I'm just trying to paint a picture of what exactly she does. Whereas the red guy only really gets a double jump and anchors around the map that he can pull himself towards. Now, while on the surface these are very basic abilities even when factoring in the switching, the platforming challenge within the game, the Path of Determination, that name sounds kind of familiar, it's very clear how intricate things can get. There's a lot of thought process that goes behind trying to remember which character does what and how best to switch between them to allow for optimal traversal. All of these aspects of Worldless all come together in a beautifully vibrant package that makes the game incredibly enjoyable for all who really want to play it. I would highly recommend any who haven't go and play the game, even though watching this you've gotten some spoilers, because the game is honestly just an extremely fun and unique endeavor to sit down and play through. Grime is a game that, similarly to Worldless, I didn't think I'd really enjoy as I started it. I wasn't sure why, but something about it just felt off, and I wasn't sure if it was going to be something I would end up finishing. However, that very quickly changed at around the second main boss of the game. I'm not even entirely sure what changed in my head, but all of a sudden it went from on the fence to absolutely loving the game, and putting many hours into it all at once because I couldn't put it down. So let's delve into some of the things that are really good about the game. First off, I want to talk about the combat. The combat in this game is nowhere near as unique as it is in Worldless, and as a result, I don't have quite as much to say about it. That being said, the combat is very good. It's more your basic run-of-the-mill Metroidvania, but with a parry. However, despite that, it does it extremely well. Everything about the combat as I went through the game felt very fluid and responsive, and I never really felt at any point like a loss wasn't my fault. While the game wasn't overly difficult at all, there were certainly times that I struggled some, but with each attempt, I was excited to try again. In fact, one of the only times I felt like a boss fight was too much in the base game was when I went to an area way too early and ended up fighting a boss that was recommended to have double jump before I even got it. I still managed to beat it, but it did kind of feel way harder than I felt the boss should have been, but I also got there early. In terms of actual combat mechanics, it's pretty simple, but still well fleshed out. There are various armor sets throughout the game that each give different buffs to the players and all have set bonuses that make wearing all of the same very handy. On top of that, the developers were smart and allowed characters to visually have a set on, while still having the buffs of a different set, which I always appreciate. In terms of weapons, there are many different types of weapons that all attack in different ways, and for each weapon you can upgrade them that allows them to do more damage. Again, it's very simple but well executed. Finally, for the game's titular charm-like mechanic. It's done through killing various types of enemies enough to unlock specific perks that you can then unlock as a passive bonus for the rest of the game. Now, I suppose it's more an enemy kill-based skill tree than it is a charm mechanic, but all the same, it's very well done and intricately thought out. Another fun addition to the combat is the fact that in the new Game Plus, the boss each get a little something extra that they didn't have in the base game that keeps things new and exciting for players, which I thought was a really nice touch, even if some of the additions were so annoying that they made me want to jump out of a 20-story tall building. But I digress, it was a good choice all the same. The art style within Grime is immensely different from that of Worldless. While there are still bright and vibrant colors, it's generally more monochrome than Worldless was. Instead, the game focuses more on building the world specifically with its visuals. The entire time you play, you are met with these odd obsession with body parts. It starts off light at first with nothing more than an odd stone body parts here and there and stone enemies, but very soon it builds up through just going to odd stone to having weird teeth and fleshy substances later on in the game. The only real bit that doesn't fit with the body aesthetic is all of the plants that end up later in the game, but that all fits in with the lore. Regardless, all the body pieces, while slightly unsettling, really nicely amplifies the world and allows the player some hints as to what's truly going on. Now, I will admit, the weird 3D model aesthetic that they have going on in the 2D environment, while mostly works, has some spots where it feels a little unnatural or goofy, but I can't specifically point out one example, as I can't quite remember any, as it was just a feeling in the moment. The story of Grime is where, in my mind, the game truly shines as I think about it afterwards. The gameplay was well and good enough and captured me long enough for me to play through it to fully platinum the game, but the story of Grime is what kept me thinking about it months after I played it. Now, with that being said, I don't fully understand every little detail of it, but I do have a general grasp of all of it. For a quick synopsis of the story, the game takes place within a celestial being that is dying, and in a desperate attempt to keep them alive, their partner uses all of their breath, which is similar to life force or blood in this universe, and pushes it into the dying celestial body, killing the partner. This has an unexpected consequence as it acts as a bad blood transfusion and makes changes within the body that were not intended as it spreads throughout. These things, I'm pretty sure, are the teeth and plants, though I could be wrong. Also, the main reason the celestial body needed to stay alive, outside of the obvious, was that they were pregnant and were hoping the extra breath would keep them going long enough so that they could give birth to the child. Again, I think. Our player character is a budding black hole that apparently appears within these celestial bodies and ends them, taking the place of their head once it grows strong enough, essentially destroying the body and not allowing life to exist nicely within it. There is a sprawling interconnection in the entire culture with the entities within the body that I will not be getting into, as it is extremely interesting. And if any of you are all that interested, I would encourage you to not only go play the game, getting all the things and reading the lore, but there are many good YouTube videos that go far more in depth with it. There is even an interaction with the unborn child that ultimately ends up leading to one of the best boss fights in the entire game, due to the child's fear of the player character. It is all incredibly interesting, and the more I learned about it, the more I wanted to learn. I got so invested that I watched multiple lore videos back to back for at least a week. The best part of it to me was that in terms of the main story, it's all something the player can easily figure out on their own as they play. If you pay attention to not only the map, but the names of places and the way people are talking, it's obvious that you are inside a rather large entity. As you gain more and more abilities in the game, it becomes immensely obvious that the main character is some sort of black hole, getting stronger and stronger. The only other Metroidvania to even remotely get me this interested in the lore was Hollow Knight, and it's not even close. The platforming within Grime, while not being the most game-changing, is honestly extremely well done. It does have a few movement abilities that aren't seen in any other games, Metroidvania-wise. The main movement abilities are a dash, a sprint, an air hover, a pull, a south pull, and a double jump. All of these work very well seamlessly together, and this is one of the only games that I have seen where the sprinting is actually used often in platforming, with movement-triggered stompies that make you have to keep moving faster or you'll get killed. Another ability that I greatly appreciated is the hover ability. This is used to greatly reduce your falling speed, but also allows you to do any of the other movement abilities, outside of dashing, I think, while you're doing it. While none of these mechanics are specifically that, deep and intriguing, they all come together very nicely to make for some great fluid movement, especially with a lot of the pulls, where the developers made a lot of different teleporty rooms that you had to quickly react to what was on the other side to determine whether or not you would fall into spikes, a trap, or simply onto safe ground. And it all works very well to make the game feel seamless and fluid. My playthrough of Grime was a very unexpected surprise that I enjoyed immensely. I am so glad that I somehow managed to find a love for this game as early as I did, otherwise I might have dropped it or not really enjoyed it as much as I have. It was a game that truly captivated me and kept me wanting more even after I played, and I quickly decided to get the platinum. even going so far as to get every achievement, even those outside of PlayStation's Platinum trophies, simply because I wanted more and more of the game. It is truly an amazing time that I would generally recommend to anyone who wants to try playing a Metroidvania game. Nine Souls is a game that I only recently completed, but it very quickly became one of my favorite Metroidvanias ever. I first started playing the game with my dad on his console, where we would pass the controller to each other based on determined switch spots. And as we got through the game, I was falling more and more in love with it, and we got most of the achievements. As we finished the game, I broke off from him and went back to replay the entire game on my PlayStation from scratch in order to get the platinum on my account, which my dad then decided to race me for. He won because he was closer, but I still feel like I did an amazing job. And honestly, that whole rant right there, I think, just goes to show how good the game really is. But shall we delve a little bit deeper? The combat in Nine Souls is a perfect example of taking a seemingly simpler idea and running with it, making it incredibly interesting. At the start of the game, all you can do is attack with your hand, parry incoming attacks, and place talisman on enemies that did a certain amount of damage based on how much ki you had, which you could upgrade through the skill tree. Throughout the game, as is common in most Metroidvanias, you get many abilities that affect both platforming and combat, some of which are a charged attack, a bow, different types of talisman, a parry that can block unblockable attacks, and an air kit. These are all incredibly easy to use and work very nicely together. On top of a massive skill tree, there is also a charm system that allows you to specialize your build for playing based on what you're doing. There are many charms, and while I personally found very few uses for all but like 10 of them, I'm sure that just came down to me not really experimenting with different builds. But on top of the Jade system, there are also different types of talismans and arrows that you can use throughout the game. For talisman, there are 3 distinct types. One, which you can charge up to 3 ki at a time, that you can then charge and blow up. A talisman which, unupgraded, takes 2 ki, but you can bring down to 1 through upgrades, that will go off on its own after you place it. And finally, there is a talisman that allows you to charge up any number of the amount of ki that you have, and then let go to cause an explosion. Now, the fun thing with this one is when you have your maximum amount of ki and you set it off, it does a greater explosion that does a crap ton of damage and staggers the enemies. For the arrows, there are also 3 different types. One is a piercing arrow that can go through multiple enemies and shields while doing a large amount of damage. A dagger arrow that swarms around and targets multiple enemies, at least I think. I'm not entirely sure, I never really used it. And a bomb arrow that leaves behind a large area that does constant tick damage for a short amount of time. All of these different varieties for the combat builds allow for extremely varied gameplay that really helps with the replayability of the game, especially when you don't do the dumb thing like me and actually experiment with all the different ways builds can be made throughout the game. The art within Nine Souls is incredibly stylized in a way that I find extremely appealing. I genuinely enjoyed the game's more Asian art style, which, go figure, that made up the background and characters. It really let me get immersed in the world with how details were consistent throughout the map. Now, even with things being consistently laid out, art-wise, the game never felt too samey, and each area was distinctive in its own ways that meshed the world together as its own cohesive unit. The meld of both regular Asian architecture mixed with futuristic sci-fi machinery was an incredibly fun way to look at the world and never seemed to negatively clash with each other. On top of that, the comic panel cutscenes that the game had were all incredibly well done, and were extremely fun to look at, especially on a first playthrough. One area in particular stood out to me throughout the entire game that I loved way more than first. At about roughly the halfway point, or just past it, there is this area where a character enters a reality created by one of the boss's dreams, and it is perfectly unsettling, peaceful, and extremely well executed. The entire time there is obviously something wrong, especially as some background characters start breaking character to say ominous words. On top of all of that, there are areas throughout the game that are pockets of these weird, dark, gruesome scenes that underlay the entire tranquil hot springs that you are walking through. Finally, there is an amazing older animation style that is seen within the boss fight that is kind of similar to like the witch layers in Madoka Magica that is throughout the entire fight and changes as you go through the different stages of the fight. And they all mesh together in a way that I very, very much enjoyed. Now, that's enough gushing about the amazing art in this game, so let's move on to other aspects. The story within Nine Souls is incredibly captivating, and unlike many other Metroidvanias, all of it does get explained within the story, especially if you try to do everything. You learn every secret from what happened to the main character, the society he came from, how it happens, and how all the bosses came to be where they are. It's all wonderfully laid out and is slowly revealed more and more, leaving me trying to predict the lore the entire time I was playing. As a general breakdown of the story, we start with our main character, Yi, who is being attacked by an unknown assailant and killed. We flash him to hundreds of years later with a human who has helped him. This kid is living in a village that is being held on a ship and isn't real, being used as only a means to farm human brains for their future plans. After saving the kid from having his brain farmed, Yi tears into the rest of the ship, slowly killing, or in one case befriending, all the other people in charge of the ship. The entire time, the player is learning of an illness that is terrorizing their people, that they came here in order to cure, using the human brains in order to hold everyone in a dream skip while they bide their time. We learn that Yi had figured out a terrible secret, and it is the reason that he was cast away and killed at the beginning of the game. But now he is back for revenge and to put an end to the terrors on his people. As we make our way through the ship, we also learn of Yi's experiments, his relationship with his sister, and how he ended up accidentally leaving her as he was killed before he could find her. For a reference, the island that they lived on was shredded to a giant ship and flown away many light years so that they could find our human brains. That is a very brief explanation of the lore, and there is literally little bits of the story with each boss and many little main characters that I personally found to be intriguing and fun to see develop throughout the course of the game. This is another game that I would highly recommend people delve into if they want to know more about it, as I'm not going to get into every little thing and don't want to spoil things for this video too much. Though, that being said, I will say the same area I talked about in the art segment for this game was by far my favorite story bit in the entire game. Throughout that portion, as it makes the perfect aesthetic and story bits, as well as a very, very banger boss fight, quickly became my favorite area of the game. Now, my biggest complaint with the story, and I guess it's more of a quality of life thing, is that there are no ways to make the conversations any faster, and no ways to skip cutscenes. This makes replays a bit more of a slog than I would have ultimately liked. Also, considering there are two endings to the game that only require a re-upload of the save to achieve both endings, I absolutely hate that the entire credit scene is 100% unskippable, no matter what. Now, I do understand the need to show off all the amazing people who worked on a game as awesome as this. There are ways around it that makes replays and even getting multiple endings way more bearable. As an idea to allow this to be done while still giving the people who worked on this game some recognition, it'd be nice to make the player sit through the credits on the first playthrough, with an added trigger that allowed you to skip the credits on a second go-around or when you're trying to get the other ending. But I digress. Also, one of the two endings is, in my opinion, incredibly lackluster, and as I watched it, it ultimately left me wanting more and had way more questions than it actually answered. I would go so far as to say that if I hadn't gotten the ending that I did the first time I played through the game, it might have soured my memory a little bit, but that could be me being nitpicky because the rest of the game did an incredible job. Finally, onto the platforming. Now, the platforming within Nine Souls is nothing spectacular, much like the rest of the games in this video. However, it does still play a crucial role in the gameplay that greatly contributed to the fluidness and speed that the game held on to. With simple abilities such as an air dash, double jump, air parry, and you could argue the skull kick ability, there isn't much to really talk about in terms of mechanics. They all work greatly as intended, and at no point did I really feel like the controls were too floaty or not floaty enough, as it balanced it perfectly and made it really fun to jump around. Honestly, the one thing I'm kind of sad about is that the game doesn't have any sort of platforming challenges that is pretty prominent in a lot of Metroidvanias. Now, there are areas that can technically count, but they're incredibly short and easy, so I don't really count them. And it is not a requirement to put these kind of things in. It's just something that I personally enjoy as it allows me to test my skills with the platforming as I've gotten later into the game. However, one complaint that I do have with technically the movement in the game is that Yi feels incredibly slow. Even when you get the dash ability that allows you to sprint when you hold the dash button long enough, he moves really slowly and the sprint really doesn't feel like it adds much. And on top of that, adding a half-second delay before you can dash again, while it does make sense, makes it not as viable an option for speeding up your locomotion. I ended up having to teach myself a bit of a trick where I would jump slightly off the ground and dash, because the air dash's only reload trigger is when you touch the ground, it can immediately go again. So I would do this constant dash jump that would allow me to move incredibly quickly. And I suppose this could have been an intended use within the game, and part of the reason why Yi was so slow is to force players to learn new ways of using the movement mechanics. But I still would have liked to see Yi be faster off the get-go. Throughout this video, I have been ranting to you guys about 3 Metroidvania games that I hold very close to my heart. While each of these games do have their own problems, they all manage to overcome them and make them amazing stand-up games that I greatly enjoy. I'm constantly trying to play new Metroidvanias as they are all mostly enjoyables on some level, but I keep having a problem where I get distracted and stop playing, which is unfortunate. With games like Biomorph, Afterimage, Ender Lilies, Prince of Persia, and many, many more, there's an entire world of games that I have yet to explore. If any of you were curious about Metroidvanias and whether or not they're good, well, that obviously still depends on your specific taste and what you prefer. I would still greatly recommend anyone that wants to check them out, especially any that catch their eye, as in general they are all varied and interesting in my opinion. They all leave me wanting more, even regardless of how good it is. Now, that could be me being a bit of a psycho, but whatever. Now, if any of you have opinions that contradict my own or think my rants were offensive, go ahead and leave a scathing comment, because honestly they're kind of fun to read. But also, any who have any fun memories or anything they'd love to share about these games or any other Metroidvanias, I would love to hear about it. Now, I hope that everyone enjoyed this rambling video about amazing games and an amazing genre, but that is all that I have for today, so I will see you all later.